Hello, this is Ted, and I'm going to be making the video for day 4 of our boot camp. These videos are going to be a little bit faster paced, but you can always pause the video and type along if you want. So we're going to be going over span and divider tags. We're going to be talking about how to target these tags using IDs and spans, and that can be used to target about any element in HTML. And we're going to learn about targeting specific elements using the Descendant Selector. So we're going to learn about something called CSS. They're called combinators. And then we're going to learn a little bit about the ordering of CSS. So this is all just a little bit technical, and up to this point it's been sort of technical, but we are going to be getting to the design part of all of this soon, because it's nice to know HTML and CSS, but if we don't know how to design, it doesn't do us much good. So we will be learning how to design web pages, especially when we get into learning Bootstrap. But not today. Today we're going to be learning more about spans and dividers. So a span tag, we'll go ahead and start with span tags. They encapsulate text or inline elements, and we haven't talked about those yet, but we'll probably talk about them on day 5. But they're mainly used with text. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this with an example. So here in this example we have our document preamble, and then we have a paragraph tag. We have 77 divided by 600 is equal to 0.1283, but this 3 should repeat forever. So we need to overline this somehow. So how are we going to represent that in HTML? And this right here, we actually haven't gone over this. This is an entity. And whenever we have an entity, it's just going to be a way of typing a character in our HTML without actually finding the character on the keyboard. Because we could fumble around on our keyboard and try to find the correct alt code for the division symbol, but instead we don't have to. We actually have an entity that we can use, and those just start with an ampersand, and then they end with a semicolon. And then in between is just whatever the entity is called. And there are actually a bunch of different entities. We should use them for the less than sign, the greater than sign, and the ampersand sign, because those are used for syntax in HTML. So if we need to use the less than sign or the greater than sign, we don't want HTML to confuse this with an actual HTML tag. And browsers today aren't going to do that in most cases, but this is just good practice to use these entities whenever it comes to the left angle bracket and right angle bracket, and for the ampersand, because we represent entities with the ampersand. When we're actually typing it, we want to use the entity for the ampersand. And if we go ahead and go to that link from W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium, and if we go ahead and open that link up in a browser, you'll see that we have a bunch of different entities here that we can use. And we don't have to know them all, but we can always find a reference online whenever we need to. So let's go ahead and get back to the spans. That's what I really mean to get to. This is just sort of something to the side. This is something that we can use. We can use entities if we like. But this 3 here, it repeats forever. So how are we going to represent that? There's no such thing as an overline element in HTML, so we can't use something like that. So what we're going to do, we're going to use a span instead. We're going to wrap that 3 in between a span tag. And now we can actually style that with CSS. Because with CSS, we can add a text decoration that will make it overlined. And we can just use an inline style here. And for its value, we can just go ahead and set that to text decoration for the property, and then overline for the value. And then that 3 is now going to have an overline over top of it, and we know that it repeats forever. So let's learn about dividers. What exactly is a divider? Well, it's going to be really similar to a span, except we're going to use these for groups of multiple elements. So we're going to use them in a way to divide our page. So here's just a little example here. We have an argument for tabs, and then we have an argument for spaces. So here's the argument for tabs. And then here's our argument for spaces. So we can go ahead and divide this page into two parts. I use tabs more frequently, but the best advice is really just to use tabs and spaces. We use tabs to indent things and then spaces to align them. So if we have comments and we want certain pieces of text to line up, we'll use spaces to align it, but then we'll use tabs to indent things. So like this right here, this is an indentation, and we would represent that with a tab character. But that's not really important. As long as there's space here and you can tell this belongs inside of this element, then it's really fine. It's not really a big deal. But here's an example with our divider elements. We can clearly see that this H1 and P, this header 1 and this paragraph element is contained within this divider, and this argument for spaces, this is contained within another divider. And this doesn't really do much by itself, but once we start using CSS for these blocks, it will become a lot more useful. So let's talk about how to select specific elements with CSS. So these dividers and spans, they come in very handy when we want to select something specific in our HTML. So let's go ahead and do an example. Right here we have our document preamble, and then we have two paragraphs. So we can give these elements an ID, and the ID just sort of looks like this. It's just an attribute on the paragraph tag, but we can use the ID on any HTML element that we want, and it's just ID, and that's the identifier for this element. You can see here that I set this one to normal text and this one to ghostly text. And you can name the element whatever you'd like. Usually we stick with alphanumeric characters, so just using the alphabet and numbers, and then dashes or underscores in our names. We don't use spaces whenever we are creating an ID, because we're actually going to use that for something different, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So all identifiers have to be unique. They cannot be the same thing. These are unique identifiers for each HTML element. Now, if we want, we can have more than one ID. We're not just limited to one. We can have multiple IDs, but those IDs have to be unique. And we separate those with spaces. That's why we can't have spaces in our identifiers. The browser is going to think that it's actually two identifiers. So that's why we can't use spaces. But what if for some reason we do want to have multiple IDs? Well, instead of giving the element a unique identifier, instead we can put it within a class. So in this example, we have ghostly text, and these two paragraph elements belong in the class ghostly text. So this becomes more useful whenever we are using CSS to style these, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. So, and another note, we can also use IDs and classes together, but again, this isn't more useful until we start using Bootstrap. But it's important to know that we can use them both if we'd like. So let's go ahead and see this in action. Let's go ahead and see the IDs in action. So go ahead and type up this HTML. I'm going to go ahead and open up my editor here. And I've already copied and pasted these examples here. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste them, but you should probably type them. Okay, so here we have our example document, and we have two paragraphs on the page, and we have normal text and we have ghostly text, and we've linked to an external style sheet, and that's called style.css. So if we look in the style.css file, we'll see that we've added a few declarations, and we haven't gone over all these, but they're somewhat obvious. You can sort of guess what they are just from reading them. So this one's going to blur our text. This one's going to increase the font size. And this text shadow is a little more confusing. This 0 and 0, this just means that it's not going to be offset in the X or Y coordinates. It's not going to be offset at all. We're going to blur it by 10 pixels, and then that shadow is going to be black. But we don't need to know that. That's not really important. We can always use a CSS reference to find out what these need to be set to. But now we can go ahead and save these files. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this CSS file. And I'm going to save this index file. And if we go ahead and open this up in a browser, here's what we're going to see. it's applied this ghostly text effect to all paragraphs on our page, because that's how it works with external style sheets. Whenever we have a paragraph tag here for our selector, it's going to select all paragraphs on the page. But what if we just want to select ghostly text? What we can do, we can just go ahead and type ghostly text as our selector, and we prefix that with a pound sign. So let's go ahead and do that. So I can just go ahead and erase the selector here, and I can type in ghostly text, and then I can save that. And then if we were to open this up in a browser, we can go ahead and refresh the page once we save it, and we'll see this first paragraph isn't styled at all, but the second paragraph is. And we get a result like this. So what if we want to apply this to more than one element, but not all paragraphs? What if we want these two paragraphs to be ghostly text, but we don't want the first paragraph to be? We can't have multiple IDs. So what we're going to do, we're going to change those IDs to classes. So now these two paragraphs belong in the ghostly text class. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and pull up our text editor, and we'll just go ahead and type this up. So our second paragraph was me too, and we assigned it a class of ghostly text. And then for this paragraph, we just changed that ID to a class. And then here in our external style sheet, we can go ahead and remove this pound sign, and we can just type a dot. This dot is going to be our class selector. So we're going to be able to select the class, and it's going to style all elements within that class. So let's go ahead and save these files, and we can pull it up into a browser again, and we'll see it only styled those two paragraphs. So let's get a little more specific with CSS. So we can select elements in HTML using selector, and we can select more specifically by typing where this element is relative to another element. And this is where combinators in CSS become more important. And there's a bunch of different combinators. There's the Descendant Selector, there's the Adjacent Sibling Selector, and there's a few others. But today we're only going to be focusing on the Descendant Selector. So the Descendant Selector allows us to select an element by specifying what the parents of that element are. So let's go over the syntax of this. So the Descendant Selector is going to look sort of like this. We have the first element here, a space, and the second element. This last element in our selector is going to be what we actually want to select. So we are not selecting the parent over here. We're not selecting that. We're just saying that this element is contained within the parent. So here's a little visual representation of that HTML. So here's the element select. In blue, that's selected. So that selects all elements here. So if this was a list item, then all list items here would be selected if they are contained within this parent. And you can see here that they are contained within that parent. Now, if this was some other parent, if it wasn't the parent specified here, these elements would not be selected. So here they are selected, and then here they are not selected. So let's go ahead and do a little example. So you can go ahead and pause the video if you like. Just go ahead and type this up. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste. Okay, so I have this typed up now, and you can see that we have our HTML here. We have two lists, an unordered list and an ordered list. And we are also linking to a CSS file, and that's just going to be right over here. We have our unordered list as our parent element, and then we have list item inside. And this is going to change any list item within an unordered list to royal blue. And then we also have another selector here, and it's going to select the list items, but it's only going to select list items within an ordered list. So any list item within an ordered list, that's going to be sea green. And then this list right here is actually going to be royal blue. So let's go ahead and open this up in the browser. Let's go ahead and save these two files, and we'll just go ahead and open up our file. And we can just go ahead and refresh. And this is the result. And we can see the browser result right here. So let's go ahead and talk about ordering CSS, because this is where CSS can become a little complicated. and we need to know how to order our CSS. So elements are displayed according to their importance in CSS, and there are 4 levels of importance that we're going to talk about here. There are more than this, but these are the 4 basic ones that we should know. So the least important is going to be the browser defaults. The browser has some styles that are already there. They may or may not be actual CSS, but they're the default style. They're the default way the element should look. And these are the least important rules. Above that is the external styles. So if we have a separate CSS file, that's going to be the next important item. And anything in our external style sheet is going to override the browser defaults. Now, what's going to override the external style sheets is going to be the internal style sheet. And that's just going to be anything within our style tag on the HTML page. And that's going to override the external style sheets. What's going to override the internal style sheets? That's going to be inline styles. So any element that has a style attribute is going to override anything in the style tag. It's going to override anything in a separate CSS file. It's going to override the browser defaults. Just to make better sense of this, let's go ahead and have a little short demonstration. So here are the browser defaults. And actually, I'll go ahead and type this up into Atom just so that we can see what the result is. Feel free to type along. And right here, we just have the browser defaults here. We don't have an external CSS file yet. And if we look at this in the browser, we have just the default style. It's Times New Roman, and it's set its default font size. And then we can override this by using an external style sheet. So in our external style sheet, we can just make all paragraphs on the page yellow. And we'll go ahead and add our link tag just so that we can actually use the external style sheet. So let's do this in Atom real quick. So in our head, we can just go ahead and type a link tag, and we'll just link this to wherever our CSS file is. And then in our style.css, we're just going to select the paragraph elements, and we're going to make them all yellow. And this is going to override the default browser styles. So if we go ahead and open this up in Chrome, text is now yellow. Now what's going to override the external style sheet? That's going to be the internal styles. So let's go ahead and type this up real quick. So we have our external style sheets here. We can see that. And now we have a style tag. We don't need this media attribute just yet. But we have our style tag. And inside there, we're going to make our paragraph elements. We're going to make them all orange. So we can go ahead and save this. And then if we open in the browser, of course, it's going to be orange because it takes higher precedence. It's going to be more important than our external style sheets. And then what's going to override that? That's going to be inline styles. And that's just going to be any element with a style attribute. So let's go and type this up. Our paragraph style is just going to equal a declaration. That declaration is going to be the color red. And once we open this up in a browser, this is going to be red text. And that's just a short overview of order in CSS. Now, when we have selectors that are identical, and they're in the exact same CSS file, the selector at the bottom is the one that's going to be shown, unless one of those selectors is more specific. So when we talked about the Descendant Selector, that's going to be a more specific selection. So we can go ahead and do an example just to show how this works. So in this example, we have our style, our internal styles. And within these internal styles, we're selecting the same element. But the one at the bottom is the last one. And the last one is always going to win. That's the one that's going to be displayed when we actually load this in a browser. So if we were to pull up this unordered list in a browser, it's going to be sea green. It's not going to be royal blue. It's going to be sea green because this is the last one. So let's go ahead and type this up in the browser. And we don't have an external style sheet right now. So if we were to go ahead and type this all up and then save it and open it up in a browser, we can refresh the page and we'll see it's sea green and not royal blue. Now, what if we were to make one of these selectors more specific? So instead of selecting just a list item, we select only list items that are within an unordered list. So in this case, this is the more specific selector. Even though this one's at the very bottom, this one at the top is more specific. So if we were to type this up in Atom, we're going to see that this is the more specific one, and all of our text is going to be royal blue. And that's exactly what happens. Now these are all royal blue. And that's basically everything we need to cover for today. We're going to be going over positioning in our next boot camp, but that's pretty much all for today. But of course, I have to add a fun fact. I always love to add a little fun fact. So today our fun fact is this. In CSS, we can add the text important to any value, minus quotations, of course. So if we just type an exclamation point, important, and we type that in our declaration, that style, that declaration is going to take highest precedence. That is going to be the most important thing that will be displayed. But please don't use it, because it only causes problems. There are very rare cases where you might need to use it, or it might be more convenient and faster to use important. It's always faster to use important because you don't have to worry about precedence. But when you mess with precedence and you use important all the time, you'll never know what exactly is going to be the element that's causing the problem. So if we have two declarations here, we have our bottom paragraph, we make it blue. And we have one up here, well, it also makes it blue. But let's say it makes it red or something. Which one is it going to be? Is it going to be red or is it going to be blue? It's going to show, if this was red, then this selector would win and it would show up this style instead. And whenever we have a very large CSS file, that can be a problem. So now that I've told you about it, please don't ever use it. You know, maybe occasionally. It's a good idea not to. But that's basically all for today. Next time we should be going over positioning, display values, how to make items float, things like that. So until next time.